The sun hung low over the Montana plains and Sarah felt every one of her 43 years in the ache of her legs as she leaned against the old cottonwood tree. She had been walking since dawn and the blisters on her feet told the story of a woman who had finally left behind everything she thought she knew about herself. The torn sleeve of her blouse flapped in the wind and she pressed her hand against the bruise on her thigh and winced at the memory of how she got it. 3 days ago she had walked away from a marriage that had slowly turned from love into something cold and hard and unrecognizable. She had taken nothing but the clothes on her back and the fierce determination that there had to be something better waiting for her somewhere beyond the horizon. Now as the afternoon stretched long and golden across the grasslands she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up and she saw him then. A man on horseback moving slow and steady across the open plain with a second horse trailing behind him on a lead rope. He wore a dark vest over a gray shirt and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, and as he drew closer she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. He was older than her perhaps by 10 years, and there was something in the way he sat his horse that suggested a man who had learned patience the hard way. He pulled up about 20 feet away and tipped his hat, and his voice when he spoke was like gravel smoothed by river water. "You look like you could use some help." Sarah straightened her back despite the pain and lifted her chin in that old familiar gesture of pride. "I can manage." The man nodded slowly as if he had expected nothing less. "I am sure you can," and he paused and looked out across the land toward where the sun was beginning its descent, "and then I am also sure that pride is a cold companion when night falls out here." She wanted to argue, but the truth of his words settled over her like a weight. "I do not have any money." He smiled then, and it was a small smile but genuine. "Did not ask for any," and he gestured to the second horse, "and my ranch is about 5 miles east, and my housekeeper Martha makes a stew that could bring a dead man back to life, and we have got a spare room if you need a place to rest." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes and she blinked them back fiercely. "Why would you help a stranger?" The man was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice carried something deeper than simple kindness. "Because someone helped me once when I needed it most," and he met her eyes steadily, "and because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is accept help when it is offered." His name was Thomas Wade, and he had been ranching this land for 30 years. As they rode toward his place he did not press her with questions and did not fill the silence with empty chatter. He simply rode beside her and pointed out landmarks and told her the names of the distant mountains and let her be. The ranch house came into view as the sun touched the horizon, and it was a sturdy wooden structure with a wide porch and smoke curling from the chimney. A woman in her 60s came out onto the porch and shaded her eyes with one hand, and when she saw Sarah her face softened with immediate understanding. Martha Flynn had kind eyes and strong hands, and she took one look at Sarah and said, "Well, now let us get you cleaned up and fed and we can worry about everything else tomorrow." That first night Sarah lay in a small clean room with white curtains that moved gently in the breeze, and she cried for the first time in months. She cried for the girl she had been and for the woman she had become, and for all the small deaths that happen in a heart when love turns to duty, turns to endurance, turns to nothing at all. In the morning Martha brought her clean clothes that had belonged to Thomas's late wife and did not make a fuss about it. They fit well enough, and Sarah came down to the kitchen to find Thomas already gone out to tend the cattle and Martha humming as she made biscuits. Over breakfast Martha told her about the ranch and about Thomas and about how he had lost his wife Ellen to cancer 5 years back. He was a good man, Martha said, and kneaded the dough with practiced hands and the kind that keeps his pain private but lets it make him gentler, not harder. Sarah stayed for 1 day and then 2 and then a week. Thomas did not ask her to leave and did not ask her to stay. He simply included her in the rhythm of the ranch life and showed her how to gather eggs from the henhouse and how to mend fence and how to read the weather in the way the horses held their heads. She learned that he woke before dawn every morning and checked on every animal under his care. She learned that he read poetry in the evenings and kept a worn copy of Frost on his nightstand. She learned that he had grown children who lived in distant cities and that he missed them but understood their need to find their own way. And slowly, without realizing it was happening, Sarah began to heal. One afternoon about 3 weeks after her arrival, Thomas found her trying to fix a broken gate hinge and he came over to help. Their hands touched as they worked and Sarah felt something spark in her chest. It was not the wild passion of youth but something quieter and deeper and more true. Thomas pulled his hand back and cleared his throat and said, "I know you have been hurt." Sarah froze and waited for him to continue. I do not know the details and I do not need to know them, but he looked at her then with those steady gray eyes, and I want you to know that whatever you decide to do and wherever you decide to go, and you are safe here for as long as you need. Something broke open in Sarah then and the words came tumbling out. She told him about the marriage that had started with hope and ended in silence. She told him about the small cruelties that had accumulated over years like dust in corners. She told him about the night she had finally understood that staying was killing her spirit one day at a time. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My Ellen used to tell me that the heart has its own wisdom and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is listen to it." He helped her finish the gate, and as they walked back to the house he said, "I lost Ellen 5 years ago and there are days I still turn to tell her something and forget she is gone." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "And I am sorry." He nodded and then he said, "But grief taught me something important, and it taught me that love is not about holding on so tight you crush what you hold, and it is about creating space for someone to be fully themselves." That evening after dinner Thomas asked if she would like to take a walk. They strolled out past the barn and up a small rise where you could see the whole valley spread out below. The sky was streaked with pink and orange and purple, and the air smelled of sage and grass and the particular sweetness of a summer evening. Thomas said, "I want to tell you something and I want you to really hear it." Sarah turned to look at him. "You are not broken," and he said it firmly and with conviction, "and what happened to you does not define you, and you have strength in you that most people will never know because you had the courage to walk away from what was killing you." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks. "And I feel so foolish, and I am 43 years old and I should have known better." Thomas shook his head, and age does not make us immune to pain or poor choices, and it just gives us more chances to learn and to choose differently. He reached out slowly and telegraphing his intention so she had every chance to step back, and he gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch burned through her, but in a good way, and in a way that reminded her that her body was still capable of feeling something other than pain. "Hurt but do not stop," she whispered. "What was that?" "It is something I have been telling myself," and she met his eyes, "and hurt but do not stop and keep going and keep choosing life." Thomas smiled, "And that is wisdom right there." They stood together on that hill as the sun set, and something unspoken passed between them. It was not a promise and not a declaration. It was simply an acknowledgement that two people who had known loss had found their way to each other in this particular moment, and that whatever came next they would face it with open hearts. The summer turned to fall and Sarah made a choice. She decided to stay through the winter and help with the ranch. Martha was getting older and could use another pair of hands, and Thomas said he would pay her a fair wage for her work. But more than that, Sarah stayed because she was learning something important about herself. She was learning that she was capable and she was strong and she had value beyond what any relationship gave her or took away. She learned to ride and to rope and to birth a calf in the middle of a cold October night. She learned the satisfaction of physical labor and the peace that comes from working with animals who do not care about your past. And she learned to trust again, and first herself and then slowly, tentatively, Thomas. They did not rush into anything. There were evenings when they sat on the porch and talked about everything and nothing. There were mornings when they worked side by side in comfortable silence. There were moments when their hands would brush and a current would pass between them and they would smile and continue with their work. Martha watched it all with knowing eyes, and one day she pulled Sarah aside and said, "I have known Thomas Wade for 20 years and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "And we are just friends." Martha laughed, and "Oh honey, and friendship is the best foundation there is." Winter came hard and fast that year, and during a particularly brutal snowstorm Sarah and Thomas found themselves snowed in together. Martha had gone to visit her daughter before the storm hit and they were alone in the ranch house. They spent 3 days keeping the fire going and checking on the animals and cooking simple meals. On the third night as they sat by the fire, Thomas said, "I need to tell you something." Sarah looked up from the book she was reading. "I am falling in love with you," and he said it simply without drama, "and I know you may not be ready to hear that, and I know you may never feel the same way, and but I wanted you to know because I am too old to play games or hide what is true." Sarah felt her heart hammering in her chest. "Thomas, you do not have to say anything," and he held up his hand, "and I am not asking for anything, and I just wanted you to know that you are seen and you are valued and you are loved." Sarah set down her book and took a shaky breath. "I am scared. I know. I do not know if I can trust my own judgment anymore." Thomas nodded, "And that is fair." But then Sarah found herself speaking from a place deeper than fear. But I think I am falling in love with you too. The relief on Thomas's face was so profound that Sarah had to smile. It is terrifying, she added. He laughed, and yes, it is. They sat together by the fire and talked late into the night about their fears and their hopes and their dreams for whatever time they had left. They talked about how love at their age was different from young love. It was more intentional and more aware of loss and more grateful for each moment. When Thomas finally reached for her hand, Sarah took it. His palm was rough from work and warm and steady. They did not kiss that night. They simply sat holding hands and watching the fire and letting themselves feel the quiet miracle of two broken people choosing to be brave enough to try again. Spring came, and with it a softness in the air that matched the softness growing between Sarah and Thomas. She had been at the ranch for almost a year, and it had become home in a way no place had been home for a long time. One April morning, Thomas asked her to take a ride with him. They saddled up and rode out to a meadow filled with wildflowers, and he helped her down from her horse and said, "I have something to ask you." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "I am not asking you to marry me," and he said with a slight smile, "and I figure we have both done that before, and maybe that is not what matters anymore." "What are you asking then?" "I am asking if you want to build a life with me," and he took both her hands in his, "and I am asking if you are willing to see where this goes, and one day at a time, and no promises except that I will show up and I will be honest and I will love you as best as I know how." Sarah looked at this man who had given her space to heal and who had seen her at her worst and chose to see her worth. "Yes," she said, "and yes, I want that." Thomas pulled her close and kissed her then. It was a kiss that tasted of patience and hope and second chances. It was a kiss that said, "You are not too old for this, and you are not too broken for this, and you deserve this." When they finally pulled apart, Sarah was crying and laughing at the same time. "Hurt, but do not stop," she whispered against his chest. He held her tighter, and "No, and do not stop." They stood in that meadow for a long time. Two people who had learned the hard way that life does not always go according to plan, but that sometimes the detours lead you exactly where you need to be. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the wildflowers danced in the breeze, Sarah felt something she had not felt in years. She felt free, and she felt whole, and she felt ready to see what came next. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be loved. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the permission to start again. No matter how old you are, and no matter how far you have fallen, and no matter how much you hurt. Do not stop. Just keep going. Keep choosing life. Keep choosing love. Keep choosing yourself. And trust that somewhere out there under this wide Montana sky there is room enough for all your broken pieces to come back together into something beautiful and new and true.